Well, when I told Reverend Leslie that I'd like to do a sermon on Japanese religion, her immediate reaction was, okay, but don't make it an academic lecture. She knew I had spent 40 years being a professor at various places. And her admonition was well advised because, you know, my sort of default posture is professorial. You know, I can't help myself. But an academic lecture is one thing, and a sermon is generally something rather different. Although I think it's okay to learn from sermons, but I have that admonition in mind, and I will be careful. And if I should stray, Michelle and I have a compact that if I go over long and I get too academic, she gets out the hook. I mean, you may not know where the hook is, but the hook is a fixture of the service. It's always there if we need it. Okay. Another reaction I had when Leslie suggested that I not deliver an academic lecture is that that's not a problem. I don't know enough about Japanese religion to deliver an academic lecture, which is true. Now, you know, there's sort of an old trope among professors that the best way to know a field or learn a field that you don't know anything about is to teach it. And in fact, I have seized the opportunity of committing to doing this sermon as a way to do a deep dive into a lot of reading on Japanese religion that I hadn't done before. Now, unless you're starting to get a little bit concerned, I do know something about Japan. I've lived in Japan quite a bit, 5-6 years altogether. Very sadly, I don't get to go back to Japan as often as I used to, or if I go, it's on my own nickel. Japan is pretty rigid, Asia in general, about mandatory retirement. So once I hit 70, boy, I was done, you know. I had been doing regular teaching, yearly teaching at Japanese universities, principally Doshisha University in Kyoto. If you've ever been to Kyoto, it's right across the street, across Imadagawa from Gosho, the old imperial palace. It's a wonderful campus, and I taught there many years. I also did some teaching at Waseda in Tokyo, and Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo, Ritsumeikan in Kyoto. But most of my time in Japan was spent in Kyoto. And many of you may know that Kyoto is a very special place. Kyoto is really sort of the center of Japanese culture. Kyoto was not bombed in World War II, thankfully, because Truman's Secretary of War, a guy named Henry Simpson, had spent his honeymoon in Kyoto, and he had a soft spot in his heart. Now, Kyoto had been on the A-bomb shortlist. Had it not been for Simpson, Kyoto would have been obliterated. Like so much of, like Nagasaki and many other places. But Kyoto is the center, really, of Japanese religion, traditional religion. It is full of temples and shrines and gardens, and some of the most famous festivals that tend to be Shinto-based in Japan are in Kyoto. It's such a treat. I mean, full disclosure, I'm a total Japanophile up here. I do love Japan. This would not imply that Japan is a perfect country in any way, shape, or form. No country is perfect. But Japan is really, really special in many ways. So, as I say, I do know something about Japan based on my experience. Also, as a researcher and a scholar and a professor, I have studied Japanese business in particular. I was a business school professor for most of my career. And you can't look at the business institutions or the economy or the society of a country without knowing something about its culture, and religion is a huge part of the culture of any country, Japan included. Okay. So let me kind of deliver my bottom line, the punchline in a sense, that I'll keep coming back to. Japan is full of religiosity. You know, just everywhere you go, there are temples and shrines and Zen gardens. You take a hike in the forest, for example, and you will see these little Shinto or Buddhist statues, or you will see a shrine or a temple, perhaps, okay? We have beautiful religious organizations in the West as well, but I think only in Japan and perhaps some other places in Asia do you find them right in the middle of a gorgeous natural surrounding. And in the case of Shinto, as I will say more about in a minute, that's because Shinto is all about nature worship. It is a folk religion, and it really deals with the divinity and the spiritual qualities of nature. Now, here's the second part of the punchline, which is that, guess what? The Japanese really aren't that religious on the whole, if surveys are to be believed, and other forms of data. Some are, about a third are practicing Buddhists. Just about zero are affiliated Shinto members. If you survey the Japanese and ask them, do you belong to the Shinto faith, they will generally say no, okay? Now, if you ask people, have you been to a Shinto service recently? Have you prayed at a Shinto shrine lately? 90% say, sure, absolutely. You know, it's part of Japanese culture. Somewhat similar in the case of Buddhism to a lesser degree. Very high proportions of the population say they participate in Buddhist services and pray at Buddhist temples, even though a minority of the Japanese actually claim an affiliation with a Buddhist organization. Okay. You might notice that 90% Shinto and 90% Buddhist, and you know, a certain percentage of others adds up to more than 100%. What's going on here, all right? Well, it is a very distinctive feature of Japanese religion that it's non-exclusive. One can be a Shintoist, one can be a Buddhist, one can be a Christian, no problem. So the usual routine when it comes to life course events is you get married in a Shinto ceremony. And you probably have a Christian ceremony on top of that. The parents who pay for these weddings are, you know, set back a pretty penny. When it comes time to die and have a funeral, that's usually going to be Buddhist, all right? So the Japanese have not had a problem with these are all interesting religions, why not do them all? Why not embrace them all? That's rather different from the way things are generally done in the West. Okay, we don't know too many practicing Catholics or Mormons and UUs. There no doubt may be a few, but that would be the exception. All right, so what are the religions that we're talking about here? Well, there are four: Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Shintoism. Taoism really, I think, affects Japanese religion kind of indirectly. It has affected it in major ways. Scholars suggest that something like 50% of Zen Buddhism really originated in Taoism. There are some Taoist temples in Japan, but I think not many Japanese will self-identify as Taoists, even though historically Taoism played an important role in the evolution. Confucianism, sort of similar, although the rules of living that Confucius laid down still seem to be rather powerful in Japan. And one of them is filial piety, okay, which is important throughout Asia. Filial piety, do we know what filial piety means? Filial piety means veneration of ancestors. It means respect for the elderly. I actually cherish that one because I happen to be a member of that last category. And believe me, when you spend some time in Asia, as Carrie and I have, you know, we get some respect there, we old folks, that we don't so often. When we ride on the subway in Singapore, for example, the young people just scatter when they're in the seats that are supposed to be reserved for old people. That doesn't happen every day on BART, let me tell you. Maybe for you, not for me. What else does Confucius say? Well, it says respect patriarchy. Okay, it says respect hierarchy. Be loyal. Okay, perform your duties. So Confucianism is really about the rules for conducting life and maintaining the social order. Taoism, which sort of emerged at about the same time as Confucianism, is really just the opposite, not exactly subverting the social order, but often kind of withdrawing from it or seeking enlightenment apart from it. Okay. Shinto is the only indigenous Japanese religion. I mentioned that a little bit. The Shinto shrines in forest settings and things of that sort. Shinto is paganism, pure and simple. There are a lot of UUs, quite a few in this church, who are interested in paganism. Usually I don't hear them talking about Japanese Shinto, but if you do a Google search, you will actually find quite a few U's who have some interest in Shinto. It is a folk religion, it is nature-based, it is polytheistic, it is animistic. Okay, it has all the ingredients of pagan religion. Now, I think very few Japanese today really believe that little deities are alive and acting out in every plant, every rock, every stream, every mountain, and so on. But there is still a sense, and I have this sense, this is part of what attracts me to Japanese religion, that nature contains the divine. There is a spiritual element in nature, in that many of us feel here too. I mean, I do a lot of camping and hiking and have always been a lover of nature. But having this, what I would call sort of infrastructure, you know, this edifice on which you can hang love of nature, you know, this traditional background that says nature is spiritual. Means a lot. I think means a lot to the Japanese. It actually means quite a bit to me. Shinto is very much about ritual. I mentioned the festivals or the matsuri that are happening in Japan all the time when people are dressed in traditional garb and these large palanquins parade down the street. Ritual is really part of the life force of Shinto. Let me just read you a quote from Catherine Boyle, who happens to be the Director of Religious Education at the Silver Springs UU Church in Maryland. She taught English in Japan, and she worked in a Shinto shrine for a while. And she says, ritual is the gateway to the sacred experience in Shinto. Constant and dedicated practices of these rituals opens your heart and purifies your spirit because they connect you to the holy. Okay. I think ritual is important. I love our UU rituals. Our water service in the fall, our flower service in the morning, the pebbles in the water, the solstice service in December, the Christmas Eve service. All of this is just great. I actually think we don't get enough of that kind of thing. You know, Americans don't do a hell of a lot of ritual and ceremony. We really don't. If you go to other countries, European countries, longer traditions and things of that sort, they do ceremony. I do not count the Super Bowl when I'm talking about ritual. All right? That doesn't matter. But ritual and ceremony bring people together. 4th of July celebrations and all of that. That's sort of one takeaway from my spiel today, that more ritual and ceremony would be a good thing, possibly for us as a church. Some of you may not agree, but certainly for this country as a whole, in my opinion. Just a little bit about Buddhism. Well, before I get into that, let me say that there is a reason to talk about Japanese religion, okay? Shinto is purely Japanese, so it's sort of the exception. But Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, you know, of course, are world religions. They exist outside of Japan. But they're sort of different in Japan. I already mentioned that Shinto is about 50% Taoism. You know the word syncretization, syncretizing, okay? It means that religions overlap and interpenetrate and affect one another. So Buddhism in Japan is quite distinctive. Aiko and Sachiko talked a little bit about that. It's rather different from what it is in China and India. So there are many strains of Buddhism. But some takeaways, and this is kind of based on my reading. Buddhism is really very mystical, okay? Even if you read an old book, and boy, I really recommend it. I had glanced at it way back when I was a hippie in the 60s, Alan Watts' book on Zen Buddhism. I recommend it to you today. Buddhism is about getting enlightenment, okay, about understanding in direct ways, not mediated by language, not mediated by symbols, not mediated by analysis, that sort of thing. Clearing your mind, the idea of emptiness, the idea of selflessness. I hear people say, I just cannot meditate, because I have this monkey mind problem. Where's Suzanne? She has a course on the problem of monkey mind. These thoughts just keep racing through my head all the time. And no matter how hard I try, I just can't clear my mind. Well, guess what? You're not clear on the concept there. That doesn't work. And that's sort of a Western way of thinking. If I work really hard, in fact, I think Malcolm Gladwell of The New Yorker wrote a book on this. Trying really hard is the secret to success. It is not the secret to success to being a good meditator and being a good Buddhist. Just the opposite. You have to be spontaneous. You have to lose that sense of self. There's so much about Buddhism, and perhaps Zen in particular, which just doesn't work for us Western minds. Again, that's part of my pitch here, that we Americans and Westerners in general have ways of thinking about things and analyzing things and learning things and understanding things that really prepare us very poorly for understanding and participating in these Asian religions. It can be done, but boy, there's a lot of baggage that has to be jettisoned before you can succeed in doing it. Let me just talk about a few differences between UUism and Japanese religion. Rationalism versus mysticism. I just mentioned that one. Okay, we tend to be pretty rationalistic. That's been a feature of UU going way back. William Ellery Channing's Baltimore sermon was all about the importance of science and rationality in approaching religion. Individualism versus holism and groupism. UUs tend to be pretty individualistic. We put a lot of stress on interconnectedness and community, etc. But that individualism strain, I think, runs really quite deep. UUs have a bias for changing institutions in order to promote social justice. Eastern religion, Japan in particular, generally tries to find enlightenment, find faith within the existing institutional structure. Conformity is more the name of the game than conflict and struggle. Focus on outcomes as opposed to process. I think part of Buddhism in particular is engaging with process. Don't worry so much about the outcome. A very Buddhist idea is the past doesn't matter, the future doesn't matter, it's the now. Engage the moment, okay? And if you do that successfully, the future will take care of itself. A lot of these ideas have found their ways into Japanese business, and that gets us into an area in which I know something. I've done research on, and I've done teaching, and so on. If you know anything, if you're an engineer, you know anything about manufacturing, you are probably aware that Japanese manufacturing has sort of become the state of the art ever since the 1980s, when Japanese companies were sort of beating up the track and the US was being left behind. A lot of what has made Japanese manufacturing successful is these religious ideas, engaging with the present, with the now. The idea of kaizen, continuous improvement. Okay, boy, that's a Zen idea if ever there really was one. I think this is, to me, one of the very interesting things about Japanese religion is that these ideas, these rules, these guidelines have found their ways into daily life in a way that I think is really quite remarkable. So I am going to wind it up here. When I was a kid, and some of you have heard me talk about this before, I was a minister's son. My father was a Unitarian minister. This was before the UUA. And my mother was a Methodist Methodist first, and then a Unitarian religious educator. So I went through the entire religious education program. which at that time was designed by Sophia Lyon-Foss, as some of you know about. One of the segments of that curriculum that really made an impression on me was the church across the street, right? Where the kids went to other churches. Now, admittedly, sometimes with some of those churches, we sat there giggling, all right, because it was pretty different from our experience. But I think it was a wonderful form of religious education. We learned about how religion is done elsewhere. That's part of what I'm trying to achieve in this sermon. How is religion done elsewhere in other countries? I don't know that much about most other countries. I do know something about Japan, and I know that religion is quite different. It has worked for the Japanese. I think there are things in Japanese religion that we can benefit learning about and possibly adopting as our own, and that is the end of my sermon. Thank you very much.